Welcome back to another episode of Tony's Tech Tips. In today's episode, we're going to replace the right rear wheel bearing on a 2024 Subaru Crosstrek. Once we've taken the wheel off, we are now going to disconnect the parking brake actuator and remove the two 17mm bolts that hold the brake caliper bracket onto the knuckle. Once we've removed the brake caliper, we can now remove the brake rotor, and we're going to remove the wheel speed sensor from the knuckle assembly. We can now move on to unbolting the hub assembly from the knuckle. There is four 14mm bolts that hold the wheel bearing to the knuckle assembly. Using my preferred method for hub removal, we will use the Lyle tool part number 40100 to pull the hub out of the knuckle. These can be pretty stubborn and may require quite a bit of force to get off. The way this tool works is it bolts to the hub and uses a forcing screw to push against the knuckle to pry the bearing out. You will notice I left the axle nut on. This is done on purpose because we want to utilize the axle to apply pressure to the back of the bearing to keep the front hub face from getting pressed out of the bearing, making it very difficult for bearings to be removed. You will see me apply force from the top of the bearing, stop, and move the screw to the bottom and apply an equal amount of force, being careful not to apply too much force because this could damage the knuckle. I carefully work the bearing back and forth once I get it moving. Once I have the bearing loosened up, I will remove the axle nut and air hammer the axle stub out, which is currently stuck in the hub. After the axle is freed up, I will hammer the bearing the rest of the way out using the Lyle tool. As you can see, these bearings can be quite stubborn and have a difficult time coming out. Now that the bearing is out, I'm going to grind off the rust ridge that's built up on the back of it so it will be easier to hammer out of the backing plate. After grinding off the rust ridge, the bearing comes out with a nice 2 hits. I will now proceed to clean the inside of the knuckle, which has built up aluminum corrosion. I am using a carbide burr, making sure not to remove too much material, focusing on just the corrosion until I hit clean metal. Next, I will use a cookie wheel to clean up the mating surface of the knuckle. Once I've sufficiently cleaned the knuckle, I'm going to blow off the debris with compressed air. I will then install the new bearing into the backing plate and install the backing plate onto the knuckle, starting one of the bolts by hand and snugging it up with an impact. Next, I will start the remaining 3 bolts into the bearing using my impact, but I will snug them up only just enough to hold the bearing in place. I will use a torque wrench to torque down the wheel bearing bolt to the manufacturer's specification. Some of you may know that that specification is 126 Newton meters for the crosstreck model and only 96 Newton meters for the Impreza model. I have my torque wrench set up incorrectly in this shot, and the correct torque was accomplished after this shot was taken. After the wheel bearing has been fastened into the knuckle, we will install the axle nut and tighten it to factory specification of 220 Newton meters in this case. After the axle nut has been tightened sufficiently, we will stake the axle nut We can now reinstall our brake rotor, and we're going to keep it held in place by installing an axle nut upside down with a lug nut over the top of it. We will now reinstall our brake caliper. I will start the 2 bolts by hand, use a ratchet wrench to tighten them down, and then achieve final torque with a combination wrench. Remember to plug in your parking brake actuator. We will now reinstall the wheel speed sensor and the 10mm bolt that secures it. We will now remove our rotor retention device and install the wheel and tire assembly. We will start the lug nuts by hand, and we'll snug them down with an impact just enough to hold the wheel on. After the vehicle is on the ground, we will torque the wheel to factory specifications, and we will test drive the vehicle to make sure the bearing noise is gone. This concludes our replacement of the right rear wheel bearing on the 2024 Subaru Crosstrek. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I'll see you next time.